Hi there, I'm Joey from EDHREC, and I have a question to ask you. But before I can even ask this question, I need to give you some context. So please first join me for a brief discussion about board wipes. I've been really impressed with recent board wipe cards from pre-constructed decks. Stick Together might just be the best card in the party time precon, slaying everything except for a band of one warrior, wizard, cleric, and rogue, making it almost always a one-sided board wipe unique to the party strategy. Damning Verdict is another impressive one, eliminating any creatures that aren't wearing counters. While you can't assure that none of your opponent's creatures will have counters on them, it's basically a guarantee that any of your own creatures won't be killed, making the destruction, again, very lopsided. Or there are new cards like Their Name is Death to get rid of non-artifact creatures, and Invasion of Fiora, which can be used in Legends Matters decks to get rid of lots of creatures out there that would stand in the way of your legendary army. And throughout time, it turns out we have many versions of these effects. Crux of Fate has been a staple of dragon decks for years now. Winds of Wrath in an enchantment deck or Slaughter the Strong in a defender's deck go above and beyond the usual task of a board wipe. A typical board wipe is reliable for its ability to level the playing field, often deployed at a time that you have almost nothing in play to lose, but it will take down a bunch of enemy creatures. But these other board wipes have two uses, where you can use them if you're massively behind in the game, and you can use them when you have tons of stuff in play yourself, just to eliminate enemy creatures and therefore clear the way for a huge combat step. That flexibility is huge, and that leads into the question that I would like to ask you. But we're not quite there yet. There's one more piece of context that we have to look at first. One more examination, so we'll do that real quick, and I'll use one of my own decks here as an example for it. So one of my decks is Ynnett Cryptic Sovereign, an Esper deck that manipulates the top card of my library to get tons of extra benefits. Ynnett can cast the top card of my deck for free if it has an odd mana cost. And I also use stuff like Baneful Omen and Keen Duelist to deal even more damage to my opponents based on how expensive my cards are. So which board wipes do I use in this deck? Well, I could load the deck with a lot of the old classic standbys, and there's certainly justification for that because those are easy to cast and they're independently solid cards. But I don't play those in this deck. Instead, my board wipes cover a couple of interesting bases. For instance, I'm playing In Garruk's Wake. Arranging a 9-mana card on top of my library feels dang good to cast for free or to chunk people with a Baneful Omen. However, I don't want all of my board wipes to be 9 mana. If Ynnett gets removed and I need to claw my way back into a game from a losing position, I need cards I can actually realistically cast. So another one I use is Promise of Loyalty. That's a board wipe that doesn't kill everything in play, but it does have a more realistic mana cost that I can hard cast when necessary, and it's still an odd mana value if I happen to hit it with Ynnett's ability. And it even works if I flip it mid-combat, unlike a lot of other board wipes, because Ynnett has Menace, so whoever I'm attacking won't be able to block her after the dust settles. That's a lot of cool versatility. Another one I play is Extinction Event, which doesn't have an odd mana cost and it's not going to kill everything reliably, but it is going to leave basically all of my own stuff alone, and that's pretty big. And I happen to play one more board wipe in this list, and that last one is Vanquish the Horde. It's not an odd mana card, but it is very, very realistic to hardcast because it's often just 2 mana to play. I don't need it to be castable with Ynnett's ability, and I can still make great use of it with my other Baneful Omen or Twilight Prophet effects in the deck. It's a board wipe, that's its primary function, and in fact it's usually so cheap to cast that I can usually follow it up with another play afterwards too. But it's not just a board wipe, it's a card whose mana value is relevant to the rest of the deck's mission. Really, that's the case for all of these board wipes. Each one of them has a different aspect to it that has a branching synergy relevant to the strategy and which can be manipulated in big ways, like using the mana cost to deal extra damage, or allowing my Menace commander to get through unblocked and stuff like that. And this isn't just specific to my Ynnett list. The board wipes that I use in my tokens deck are also all cards that help out with a ton of tokens. Or in my zombie deck, I use cards that level the playing field while still leaving me with stuff left over. In every one of my decks, the board wipes are rarely just board wipes, and I imagine this is true for a lot of you out there too. Now, after spending all this time talking about board wipes, here, at last, is my question. Why aren't you playing Sardian Avenger in your red decks? Okay, I admit, probably not the question that you were expecting. Like, here I am talking about board wipes, and this little goblin guy probably feels a little out of left field. But allow me to make my case. I recently asked this exact question to my podcast co-hosts. Why aren't they playing Sardian Avenger in their red decks? Many folks in the Commander community have talked at length about the domination of treasure-making cards out there, after all, and given their huge popularity in the format, this card seems like great anti-treasure tech. So why are its numbers kinda low? Is it just because it's new and a little unknown? Even if you didn't know about it before, now that you do, would you play this in your red decks? Well, you may already be able to guess the answers that I got to those questions. Why aren't we playing this in our red decks? Because we can't take full advantage of it. My co-host Dana said he'd probably only use this card in a deck like Goblins, or a Warriors deck, or a deck that's already giving out artifact tokens to other players. My co-host Matt voiced his concern that the card is more reactive than proactive, because it depends upon your opponents to really reach its full potential. He'd be most likely to play it in, for instance, his red equipment deck, where he can use the body more efficiently to carry a bunch of weapons, or in a deck that already happens to contain a Mycosynth Lattice, turning everything into an artifact and therefore really hypercharging this card's value. And as it happens, this is exactly what we see in the data for Sardian Avenger. It's seeing the most play in Goblin decks, and in decks that give out artifacts to other players. While treasures might be everywhere, players are not rushing for a card just because it's good against some new aspect of the Commander metagame. As Matt mentioned, metagaming in Commander doesn't feel good when it's reactive. We want it to be proactive. We want the power of the card to be derived from what we ourselves are doing. After all, Magnetic Mine has existed for years, and when treasures became more of a thing, it's not like we all rushed out to play that one, did we? Viridian Revel has admittedly seen an uptick in popularity in recent months, but it's slow going, and it's still mostly relegated to a lot of the same types of decks as the Sardian Avenger. To use another metagaming example, even Graveyard Exile effects, which are tremendously helpful for dealing with many popular commanders and strategies out there, are at their most popular when they're on lands. Compare the numbers for Relic of Progenitus against the numbers for, say, Scavenger Grounds. Taking up a spell slot is a lot harder to justify, whereas a land is unobtrusive. Playing a mana source still advances your own plans, regardless of what's happening in the rest of the game. Plus, after all, even if you put a silver bullet answer into your deck, who's to say that you'll draw it at the time you need it? Or that you'll even encounter the problem that needs answering in every game that you'll play with that deck? You might not encounter treasures, or you might not have a graveyard opponent, that kind of thing. It feels like taking a risk to play certain spells like these, because they have the opportunity to be a total dud, when instead you could play something in that slot that would better help advance your own board state. As we can see, players want cards not just for their individual abilities, but for our ability to take advantage of more than just their text box. And that's why I was talking about board wipes earlier, because it's kind of the exact same thing there. The reason that I'm not playing Sardian Avenger is kind of the same reason that I am playing all of those specialized or thematically appropriate board wipes, rather than the typical standbys like Wrath of God and things like that. A heavy facet of Commander deck building these days is that we want to use all parts of the buffalo. In fact, let's take the new Tyvar Planeswalker as another example of this. I made a comment about this card in a recent EDH podcast episode in the context of my Baba Lysaga deck. Tyvar has 3 very relevant abilities for that deck. It hastens activated abilities, it untaps stuff for multiple activations, and it can get stuff back from the graveyard. In our discussion about this card, I offhandedly mentioned that if any one of these abilities was different, say if its minus ability was to give out random +1 counters or something, then I wouldn't want to use it in that deck. And I still think I feel that way. If only 1 or 2 parts of the card were significant, but the last part was a total dud for the strategy, I think it would be really easy for me to justify cutting that card, because subconsciously, the fact that I'm not able to use all parts of the buffalo would nag at me. I'd feel like maybe another card could go in that slot where I could take better advantage of all of that card's many moving parts. And yet, this logic obviously has a breaking point. For instance, there are charms out there, like Rakdos Charm or Naya Charm, where just 1 or 2 of the modes is all you need. Rakdos Charm could just have the damage ability, and I would still consider it to be an A+ card worth using, because that ability just KOs so many players out of nowhere. Or Naya Charm. I can't even remember the last time I saw someone use the damage ability on that thing. But I've seen the recursion effect tons of times, and that tap ability is so dang flexible. It can save your bacon or clear the way for a lethal attack. It is seriously so good. The extra text on those cards is pure gravy. I feel like I don't even need those other modes for the cards to still be useful. And that's a far cry from my feelings about Tyvar. So what gives, right? And this goes the other direction. There are plenty of examples where I would absolutely say to avoid the synergy card in favor of something more reliable. There's a party-based removal spell out there, and it's a really fun card, but I don't put it into my party deck because I want more reliable and efficient removal spells instead. If I had a wizard deck, I wouldn't want to play that wizard counterspell out there because I could just play actual counterspell, you know? Heck, since I was talking about board wipes, Cyclonic Rift, for example, is explicitly one-sided when it's overloaded, and it is the queen of flexibility. It wouldn't have any direct synergies in my Yannette deck at all, but let's be real, it doesn't need them. I don't currently play it in that deck, but if I did, it's not like I would be wrong to do so. In fact, people might argue that I'm wrong not to play it there. The card is so good that you don't need extra synergies or ripple effects in the rest of the deck to justify using it. So how do we reconcile that? I'm giving classic board wipes all this guff for not having direct synergies with some of my strategies, but clearly some cards out there are so good that those synergies don't matter. That distinction interests me a lot because of the often discussed Goodstuff conundrum. It feels quite normal to see Dockside in a Goblin deck or a Treasure-focused deck, but it would be pretty weird to see Dockside Extortionist or a Consecrated Sphinx in, like, a Dragon deck. Like, yeah, they're good cards, they'll make the deck work, but it's also a little bit like, really, Queen? Like, are those cards supposed to be honorary dragons? But to that end, I feel slightly the same way about Sardian Avenger. It has the exact opposite job, it's anti-Dockside. But it would feel just as weird to see that in a dragon deck too. Commander players have stated time and time again that they don't want overpowered cards that feel like they just go in any deck. But that goes both ways. We don't want overpowered cards that just go anywhere, but we also don't want the answers to those overpowered cards to just go anywhere either. And at least in my own personal deck building habits, my board wipes also kind of reflect a similar philosophy. I'm not using Wrath of God anywhere in any of my decks. I'm using a lot of other stuff instead. Even in other colors, I've swapped out Damnation from several of my black decks to instead opt for a board clear that might be better able to offer me more than just brutal efficiency. For example, I have several decks that deal AoE or Aristocrats damage, and when I swapped Damnation out for a Deadly Tempest, which can deal even more damage, it has actually helped me win a couple more games by dealing the last little bit I needed. I think one of the remaining places I still use Damnation is in my Reanimator deck, where the mana curve is blisteringly low and I almost never have more than 5 lands in play overall. So Damnation and Toxic Deluge are the only 2 board clears that it ever feels like I'd actually properly be able to cast. But did you catch that there? In that deck, I have to care about low mana costs. Playing a 6 or 7 mana board wipe in that deck would mean I almost never get to cast a board wipe. So even there, using a classic board wipe is still a specialized or thematically appropriate choice, because those board wipes lean into a particular facet of that strategy. And this isn't just restricted to board wipes or to metagame answers either. In a previous video, I had a similar conundrum just trying to pick which mana rocks to use, because each one of those rocks offered some unique aspect or synergy to that deck, and I constantly feel like I'm struggling with weighing those synergies against simple, dependable efficiency. That line right there, that's what I'm interested in here. That distinction between when a card is good enough to use even without a bunch of branching synergies in the deck, versus when it feels like we only want to use a card that does have those synergies. I think this could be an important lesson for players as well as for game designers, like whether it's mana rocks or board wipes or metagame responses, the desire for our cards to belong is a strong psychological force that dictates a lot of our card choices. One of the things Wizards of the Coast has done as the number of products they release has increased is to introduce a lot more nicheness to those different strategies. And I'm frankly very glad for this. Like, I prefer the world where we are getting more rewards for unique strategies rather than a world where every format staple is constantly being power crept to make it more compelling. Like, we don't need more and better Cyclonic Rifts, you know? We need more rewards for niche strategies so that building your deck to a specific theme helps you build your own Cyclonic Rift, so to speak. So this is a really important thing for designers to keep in mind. If they're trying to print some type of response to really big things that are all over the Commander format, well, you have to reward nicheness in your card design, and that can only get you so far along in answering a big problem. But moreover, the practical reality of Commander player habits is a thing you absolutely must contend with. Commander players clearly like proactive cards more than reactive cards. On the flip side, as players, we also have to keep this in mind, in a couple of different ways actually. Like, for one thing, we need to be very conscious of the times where occasionally we might go a little bit too far in that proactive mindset, and therefore we fail to pack a reasonable amount of responses to what our opponents are doing into our decks. But also, we as players need to make sure that we're very understanding towards the ways that other people brew their lists. Telling someone, hey, here are some really efficient cards that you could be using to increase your deck's ability to do the thing, that can be very good advice. And yet sometimes it can also be something that totally misses the mark, because sometimes players only want to play a very thematic choice and they don't want to break the flavorful immersion of their list. To take an extreme example of this, I have that Commander deck where every card in the deck has to say the word Commander on it. And no joke, I get some very unsolicited feedback about that deck from people who have to let me know that that deck's really not optimized, or that my removal is bad, or whatever. And I'm like, yeah, I know it's not optimized, friend. That's sort of the point. Or, as another example, I bet a lot of folks will tell me that I should probably use Toxic Deluge in a lot of those decks that I mentioned earlier. And yeah, it's a good card. I mean, it's expensive. I don't own that many, but more to the point, this video is sort of my way of processing a certain anxiety that I have about trying to make sure that my decks don't devolve into good stuff or whatever, to, make sure that I'm playing thematic or original or unique things in my deck. But I'm also trying to make sure that I don't resist efficiency so much that I swing around to the other end and I only end up playing thematic cards that in reality aren't all that. Where do you draw that line? When is it more strategically appropriate to go with one of the old standbys? And when is it more strategically beneficial to use something that is more specialized or thematically appropriate in that card slot instead? And that's the thing. Ultimately, there's no right place to draw that line. And the unfortunate reality is that since everyone is drawing their lines in a bunch of different places, it is absolutely possible to build a deck that you think really, really strongly stays to one theme, but which still reads to other players as unoriginal or good stuff. Sucks, doesn't it? That doesn't mean give up, it's pointless. It just means that it's worthwhile to have answers to the questions that people will ask about your answers. Like, why aren't you playing Sardian Avenger? Well, for me, it's because I think I could probably use all the parts of another Buffalo in that card slot instead. Why am I not using the classic Wrath of God standbys? Well, because in these cases, I'm sometimes willing to gamble on certain cards that have a lower floor, but potentially a much higher ceiling, and I think that makes for engaging gameplay. So that's me, but now it's your turn. Why do you play the cards that you play, and where do you draw your lines? Let me know down in the comments. Thanks so much for watching, and remember, EDH wreck your deck before you wreck your deck.